This is the Everything History Podcast, episode 22, The Execution of the Girondins and Marie-Antoinette.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
At the tail end of the previous episode, I had just gotten to the creation of revolutionary tribunals and the Committee of Public Safety. Allow me to go into detail because those two governmental institutions are fundamental to this story. The Revolutionary Tribunal was formed on March 10th of 1793, and it was a court specifically created to try counter-revolutionaries. But counter-revolutionary was becoming a very loosely defined term in France. By late spring, anybody just ideologically opposed to the ideas and laws of the National Convention or the Jacobins was to be considered a counter-revolutionary. It is also important to note that there were multiple tribunals, but the Paris Tribunal would become the most dominant and most infamous. These revolutionary tribunals were composed of a jury and a prosecutor, all of whom were put in place by the convention, which meant that the Mountain could decide who was on the tribunal's bench. Most important of all, though, the tribunals were put in place to rapidly dispense sentences and, listen up here, there was no appeal to the tribunal's decisions. With such power, the revolutionary tribunals would soon be instrumental to the thousands guillotined within months. The other institution that needs fleshed out is the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was formed on April 6th with at first only 9 members, and it was created with the blessing of the Girondins and the Montagnards alike. At its inception, though, the committee had very little power because power still resided with the National Convention. Yet, in a matter of months, the membership of the committee would be expanded and its powers would grow exponentially. As of April 1793, though, both the tribunals and the Committee of Public Safety had minimal power. So, as we dive back in, France is being ripped apart, from within and without. Revolutionary France was exasperated by the ongoing war of the First Coalition, there were counter-revolutionary riots throughout the countryside, and the radicals of Paris were attempting to manipulate the National Convention. And I find that latter point to be quite interesting. And it's one that I've only vaguely mentioned previously. Now let me rectify that by identifying who these quote-unquote radicals in Paris really are, because they too are of paramount importance. There are many groups, but by far the most recognizable were the sans-culottes, and that is spelled S-A-N-S-C-U-L-O-T-T-E-S. The strange word, but the sans-culottes were the ones who helped the Paris Commune take over in August of the previous year, and they had a habit of violently marching to get what they wanted. I mention this because they would, of course, do so again. In fact, the sans-culottes were such a threat that the Girondins would suggest moving the convention outside Paris to Versailles to avoid the violent pressure of the sans-culottes. Alright, that's enough housekeeping of lexical semantics, and in the words of Bill Burr, let's plow ahead. The foundation for the Reign of Terror has been established whether or not anybody knew it, and it is now early April 1793. The Girondins and the Montagnards were at it again, and in early April the Girondins were doing everything they could to hold on to power and support after having been expelled from the Jacobin Club by the Mountain. So the Girondins passed a measure in April that abolished delegates' immunity from arrest. Why did they do this? Well, the Girondins hated Jean-Paul Marat for his promotion of violence and insurrection and were clearing the legal paperwork to remove Marat from politics. Yet this removal of delegational immunity would come back to haunt Brissot and the Girondins. It didn't take long for the Girondins to move on Marat either. They moved to impeach Marat on April 12th, and the impeachment passed thanks largely to the absence of many Montagnard leaders. However, the victory was short-lived because it turns out the revolutionaries of Paris loved Marat, especially the sans-culottes. Therefore, it was by no surprise that the Revolutionary Tribunal acquitted Marat only 3 days later. And Marat's acquittal by the Paris Tribunal and the political pressure engineered by the sans-culottes is a landmark of 1793. It's a landmark because it was a shot across the bow directed at the Girondins, a clear indication of how political winds were blowing. This was made all the more clear when Montagnard leaders returned to Paris in late April. They fully supported the actions of the Tribunal, the local Jacobins, and thereby the sans-culottes radicals. And this approval by the Mountain was seen as validation by the radical Parisians, and moreover, it gave the sans-culottes confidence to reopen discussions about grain prices. If you recall, in late February, Paris had erupted into a series of grain riots after the National Convention refused to set a maximum price on grain. But the riots had failed because the Mountain and the Girondins knew the economic consequences of such a short-sighted law. Yet in late April now, the Parisians took advantage of the political turmoil again and demanded set grain prices. The Girondin delegates immediately denounced such an idea, but the Mountain was uncharacteristically quiet. And therefore it was no surprise that thousands of armed sans-culottes and other zealots surrounded and even invaded the National Convention demanding set grain prices. The Girondins held firm under threat of violence, but the leading Montagnards decided to change their position. They decided to support the idea of a max price. Now, why did the Mountain do this? Well, they didn't do this out of fear. No, they did so in order to gain the popular support of Paris. Because with that support, it was easier to control the convention, the tribunals, and the committees with less Girondin interference. And so it was that a maximum price law on grain passed on May 3rd. This extreme action by the Mountain in Paris was then echoed by the Jacobin clubs of the provinces. Due to this, the unrest and rebellion in the provinces, especially in the cities of Marseille and Lyon, intensified because farmers simply couldn't survive by the prices decreed, and this gave the provincials one more reason to despise and distrust the bourgeoisie of Paris. And when the Jacobins tried to establish a commune to restore Parisian control, Lyon erupted into full-scale resistance to the Mountain and the Jacobin-controlled convention. By late May, early June, Lyon was legitimately at war with Jacobinism, so much so that the Mountain-led convention ordered soldiers to besiege the city and reiterated a decree that all rebels were to be killed on sight. As you know from the last episode, though, the inner rebellion was far more widespread than just cities like Lyon and Marseille. Approximately one-third of the nation's territory was in a state of guerrilla civil war by June 1793. Historical analysis estimates that 40,000 provincials actively considered themselves part of a scattered Catholic and/or Royalist army. Luckily for Paris and the Mountain, these 40,000 plus anti-republicans or anti-revolutionary Frenchmen were far more interested in protecting their own families' land and local provinces than they were about marching on Paris. Nevertheless, the people of Paris were once again in a state of perpetual fear. It is no surprise then to discover that the revolution would be amped up another few notches in Paris by guess who? That is correct, the sans-culottes and the Montagnards. Yes, in early June, the Paris Commune and the emboldened sans-culottes demanded the expulsion and arrest of 30 Girondins from the convention, a demand that the convention should have shot down, but the Mountain did not do so. And the radicals demanding this did not do so peacefully either. No, they were determined to get their way through violent force. Getting what you want through violence is not new to the French Revolution, though. In fact, it was basically a cliché at this point. What is surprising, though, is that the Jacobins went along with it. Before I get to why they did that, I'm going to paint the picture of this early June scene to provide some much-needed clarity. The whole debacle really started on May 31st, when the insurrectionary Commune of Paris petitioned the convention to arrest 22 Girondin delegates, but Robespierre led the Montagnards to dismiss the impeachment and pass the petition along to the Committee of Public Safety. The situation should have ended there, but news arrived the next day of the rebellious warfare in Lyon, Vendée, and several other new uprisings. With this quote-unquote horrifying news, it seems that many Montagnards were of a very different mind about the petitions to arrest the Girondists. Many Montagnard delegates believed that the removal of the Girondin element from the convention would allow the Republic to run more smoothly. And run more smoothly is simply a euphemism for consolidating power and removing political enemies of the Jacobin Mountain. I should note that many prominent Montagnards still oppose this idea, like Georges Danton, who declared himself quote-unquote outraged at the idea. The next day, June 2nd, after the National Convention was in session, they were surrounded by a mob of armed fanatics that numbered in the tens of thousands, demanding now the arrest of 30 Girondins. And we're not just talking about a mob of angry men and women that brought out some pitchforks, we're talking about thousands of riled up people with military weaponry and even cannon. Oh, and there's also a great anecdote from this event that really shows the tension of the day. It came when the president of the convention ordered the commander of the mob to disperse the crowd, to which the commander by the name of Henriot responded, quote, "You tell your fucking president that he and his assembly can go fuck themselves, and if within 1 hour the Girondins are not delivered, we will blow them all up," end quote. And immediately afterward, cannon were put in place right outside the doors to the National Convention. And with all of this in mind, I hope you can understand why the Jacobins bowed down to the pressure. Well, understand is the wrong word, but at least you can see that it was not really a surprise that the convention ordered the arrest of the Girondins. Some of the delegates that were arrested were Jérôme Pétion, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, and Vergniaud. It is even said that at the palpable moment after the vote was carried out against the Girondins, that all in the convention were silent, until Vergniaud rose and offered his glass to the Jacobins and asked them if his blood would satisfy their thirst. But his noble defiance was met with silence. The provinces reacted to this Girondin purge by digging in their heels and continuing to defy Paris. But it would be a mistake to assume that the ousting of the Girondins was a Jacobin conspiracy. The Montagnards did not truly conspire to control the entire governance. It sort of just occurred by happenstance because the sans-culottes and the National Guard had basically put a gun to the convention's head. Quite literally, actually. But the Mountain did take advantage of the situation. They expanded the authority of the Committee of Public Safety in early June so that the appointed delegates now had larger jurisdiction to combat the politics of the Paris Commune and other institutions. Also, on June 24th, the Montagnards pushed through a new Republican constitution, the Constitution of 1793 or the Jacobin Constitution. It would be ratified and put into effect by mid-August. Disorder in Paris arrived again, though, on July 13th when Jean-Paul Marat was murdered, and 4 days later, news came that Jacobin officials were being executed by counter-revolutionaries in the provinces. Those occurrences led moderate Jacobins to fall from popularity during July and August. So it was that Danton and his friend and fellow moderate, Delacroix, were not re-elected to the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre and a man of similar convictions named Louis Saint-Just were on the ascendant, though. So it was that they were elected to the Committee of Public Safety on July 27th. And Robespierre declared that his top priority was, quote, food supply and popular laws. The rest of the summer, France was embroiled in the constant heat of warfare. The War of the First Coalition was not truly hammering France during the summer, but it was a looming catastrophe that threatened to strike the Republic at any moment. The true warfare continued to be from within. Marseille and Lyon continued to hold out strongly, but other provinces by August were restored to Jacobin control. Certainly by August 10th, the rebellions were much more manageable. I say August 10th because that was the day the Constitution of 1793 was officially ratified, and also a day of celebration for Paris. A festival and parade was put on to commemorate the insurrection of August 10th from the previous year. But the ratification posed a few problems as well. The primary issue is the ratification implied that a new government would succeed the National Convention, exactly like the Legislative Assembly succeeded the National Constituent Assembly after the Constitution of 1791 was ratified. Moderate Montagnards actually proposed exactly that, with Delacroix putting the proposal to the convention on August 11th. But the situation proved to be more complicated than that, because Robespierre came out against the idea, stating that forming a new government while France was in such a poor state would only create further instability. Now, there is some sound logic in Robespierre's argument, but the cynical realist in me finds that Robespierre said as much because it would jeopardize the Mountain's position, and more importantly, his position, if the government changed. And the people of Paris certainly desired strong, stable leadership, so Robespierre's move for the continuation of the convention and its committees won the day. But who was to lead was in constant limbo because the variables were rapidly changing all the time. For example, the British Navy was now fully engaged in shutting down French trade, and by late August they had even captured several French coastal ports. Another variable would be the economy, which was absolutely deplorable by August. Almost no French currency held any value, and trade was basically non-existent for a plethora of reasons, namely the war. By September, though, it was clear that the leaders were going to be the ones most willing to go to extremes. In fact, by the end of August, the most popular groups, clubs, and publishers were those that demanded the death penalty be the penalty for all criminal action. Criminal action in this case meant being a traitor, counter-revolutionary, a speculator, a Catholic sympathizer, a non-Jacobin, or simply someone suspicious. This talk of expanding the death penalty was not a new idea either. It was actually quite popular among Enlightenment thinkers, but it had yet to be truly implemented. The whole idea was that if crimes above misdemeanors were punishable with execution, no one would commit them, right? Now, that sure does sound stupid, to me at least, but it was nevertheless an idea that sounded applicable to the Parisians during the time of crisis in 1793. Their logic being that if they could purge the city and the country of anti-revolutionaries, then the rebellion would be beaten and the republic could surge to greatness. That is a narrative, though, that is played out far too many times in history with varying degrees of tragedy as a result. And with all that in mind, the stage was set for terror to spread over France. The story of how the Reign of Terror began is very much akin to the expulsion of the Girondins on June 2nd. With pressure applied on the National Convention by the sans-culottes. On September 5th, all places of business were closed and the sans-culottes gathered themselves and the people of Paris to once more besiege the convention to pry out the legislation they wanted. And what they wanted was further maximum price laws and more enforcement of the current max price on grain, and they also called for the massacre of the unpatriotic and disloyal. And once again, the convention was forced to submit to the extremism of the sans-culottes, and this was the beginning of the Reign of Terror. Terror was to begin slowly in France, but the blades of the guillotines were now being sharpened. And the ambitious and ruthless of Paris were about to see the opportunity to exterminate their enemies. In response to the September 5th action by the convention, one Bertrand Barrère, a delegate to the Committee of Public Safety, famously said, quote, "Terror is the order of the day." Now that's a timeless quotation in itself, but allow me to read his full quote to expand the perspective. Quote, "Terror is the order of the day. This is how to do away instantly with both royalists and moderates and the restless counter-revolutionary scum. It will be a special operation for the revolutionary tribunals." Indeed it would be, because by September it was quite clear that the National Convention no longer held the true power. It was the Committee of Public Safety who truly controlled the legislation, and it was the Revolutionary Tribunal of Paris that truly controlled the justice. This power transfer would not be official until November and December, but when the approval of the delegates and men of the Committee of Public Safety became a necessity for legislation, it's pretty dang obvious. One such piece of legislation was the Law of Suspects, which was a terrifying law passed on the authority of the Committee of Public Safety alone. The law stated that the committees of the convention had the authority to arrest, quote, "those who, by their conduct, associations, comments, or writings, have shown themselves partisans of tyranny or federalism and the enemies of liberty," end quote. There are a lot of problems with such a law, but the one I see is the fact that anybody could now be arrested under such broad terms. There is also another law passed on September 29th, this time by the convention itself. This was the General Maximum Law that placed price restrictions on nearly every food and food-related product. This was all well and good, but the zealots and radicals of Paris desired more. They wanted quote-unquote traitors to be made an example of. Specifically, they wanted to make an example of the somehow still alive Marie-Antoinette and the arrested Girondins. Oddly enough, Robespierre was one of the only delegates to vocally denounce the trials of Marie-Antoinette and the Girondins. This minor opposition mattered little, for the sans-culottes got their way and both were put on trial in the Paris Tribunal on October 3rd. Their trials were complete within days, and all were to be executed in public by guillotine. Then something even more drastic occurred before the show executions. The convention, at the request of the Committee of Public Safety, suspended the Constitution of 1793 by declaring the government and the nation in a state of revolutionary emergency. These emergency measures placed all rights in suspension until the crises, both external and internal, were over. Louis Saint-Just justified this in the name of the Committee of Public Safety by stating, quote, "It is impossible for revolutionary laws to be executed if the government is not constituted in a revolutionary way," end quote. The executions began immediately after, ushering in 9 months of terror. The Reign of Terror would see 16,000 to 19,000 French people executed by guillotine alone, and when the blades of the guillotines were busy or blunted, the courts used other methods, such as grape-shot cannon fire, firing lines, and other even more medieval methods to murder their victims. A very important point everyone should know about the Reign of Terror is that most of the deaths actually occurred in the provinces. The deaths in Paris were the most famous, and it all started in Paris, but the amount of people killed in the provinces is still up for debate. Lowball numbers put provincial deaths at somewhere between 10 to 15,000, but the deaths could have honestly been as high as 25 to 35,000. We'll never really know. Most of these deaths came after the fall of counter-revolutionary strongholds like Vendée or Lyon. Alright, I think it's best to just go through this fairly methodically. Marie-Antoinette was executed on October 17th, and witnesses say she died quite bravely, probably to spite the bloodthirsty maniacs of Paris. Next, on Halloween, the Girondin leaders were also guillotined one by one. Jacques-Pierre Brissot, Pierre Vignoid, Madame Roland, and 18 others lost their heads as they all sang Marseillaise. Those that had escaped Paris met similar fates. Jérôme Pétion and François Buzot put bullets in their own heads, and they were found weeks later apparently half-eaten by wolves. And when Jean-Marie Roland heard of his wife's execution, he also promptly committed suicide. The purge by guillotine intensified thereafter. In November, more patriots were served to the guillotines of Paris, including Antoine Barnave, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and the Duke of Orleans. I'm going to conclude episode 22 there, with the literal head count at approximately 180, but the bloodshed had just begun. Next episode will definitely be titled The Reign of Terror, no doubt about that, and it should be the penultimate episode of the French Revolution. And of course, if you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe and review this podcast on iTunes. Also, corrections and questions may be directed to everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.